Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start in a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mimi Seifert-Weert. I'm the Deputy Director for Digital Scholarship here at the library, and I would just like to welcome you all to this session. So, International Open Access Week is celebrated worldwide every year at the end of October, the last week in October. And it's just to remind ourselves that open access is really an established and recognized publishing strategy. And our latest statistics show that this university's research output, 56% of it is actually published open access at this stage. So that's actually a lot of progress. So I just want to introduce our 4 speakers for this afternoon and also invite you. Today is the first of 3 sessions. There will be one tomorrow and one on Friday as well. So the theme this year is open for climate justice. Our first speaker who is going to be joining us via MS Teams is Professor Oliver Ripple. He's from the Department of Mercantile Law at the Faculty of Law, and he's a professor here since 2011, and he also serves as the director of both the Development and Rule of Law program at Stellenbosch and at the Research Center for Climate Law at the University of Graz in Austria. He will be talking about climate justice versus climate responsibility, a north-south perspective. Our second speaker is Dr. Dominic Okoliko. He is from the School of Public Leadership. He's an early career researcher and postdoc fellow at the School of Public Leadership, and he's got a multidisciplinary background in the arts and social sciences. He will be talking about Voices from the Bottom, a social media analysis of public views on the COP26 coal phase-out deal for South Africa. And then lastly, we will welcome Professor Helen de Klerk and Mr. Curtis Bailey. They will be talking about in the climate change fight, GIS and Earth's observation is might. So Helen has been involved in geographical information systems since 1998. And Curtis has also been involved in GIS and remote sensing since 2017. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Professor Ripple. I hope he can share his screen with us. After every session, there will be a chance for questions for the speakers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I trust that you can hear me and see me. Can I just get a brief thumbs up from you?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I have the pleasure to address you on the issue of climate justice versus climate responsibility, a South-North perspective. And I will start with a little intro, tell you something about climate justice and its multidimensionality, and then go into the nexus between climate justice and climate responsibility, sketching out a few pathways predominantly for the global South. Let me start with a question. Does climate justice demand that those, especially in the global South, who are least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions are not the ones suffering the most by the adverse effects of climate change? That is, so to say, the caveat question. And to respond to this question is a complex and interwoven bundle of legal, political, economic, and philosophical issues, and probably more. The legal issues inter alia deal with the question whether and how states and companies, especially from the global north, can be held accountable for past, present, and future contribution to or inaction against climate change and its consequences. This is the issue that I've been grappling with for more than 10 years. And it's not only me that has been grappling with this issue. Fact is, the most affluent countries in the world, in predominantly the global north, are responsible for around half of all the greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution, leading to privileged lifestyles in Europe, in North America, and other countries in the global north who produce the major carbon footprints, which is much higher, of course, than in the global south. Now, we are facing an ecological crisis that brings about global inequalities to the surface even more with climate change, widening existing inequalities, undermining efforts of poverty reduction and development. Now, let me come to the issue of climate justice. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of climate laws, regulations, and policies is a concept that tries to respond to the challenge of climate justice. This is directly connected to a rights-based approach to unjust distribution of greenhouse gas emissions, of pollution, of elimination of biodiversity, and more. This offers insight into how climate justice must be considered globally, linking it to societal issues as a root cause of the injustice, allowing for more intersectional considerations of interlocking problems. Now, how can we better understand the concept of climate justice? And I will go into various types of justice. Number one, capabilities justice. There we have to ask the question, what are the capabilities of people and how can they respond to certain challenges in order to lead a dignified life? Secondly, the issue of distributive justice. Who has the resources and who lacks the resources to become more resilient to the impacts of climate change? Who benefits and who is actually harmed? Thirdly, recognitional justice. Who needs and who has the representation in the dialogue? Who leads the dialogue? Who is recognized as a player and who isn't? Leading to the fourth concept of procedural justice. There, and we have COP27 coming up in 2 weeks' time in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. What is the decision-making process and who is actually involved in the climate negotiations? These are some of the types of justice related to climate justice, providing an insight into what other rights might be at stake in a particular issue, leading to a better understanding of stakeholders, positions of power, the institutional pain points and opportunities for addressing climate injustice. Now, let me come to the aspect of the multi-dimensionality of climate justice, which expands out and intersects with all other segments, social segments relating to justice. Human-induced climate change is causing weather and climate extremes across the globe to change, and particularly in Africa, putting pressure on already strained food systems, causing mass displacement and more. Therefore, human action and consequently human inaction have caused this planetary crisis. All this has severe impacts on human rights, including inter alia access to adequate food, water, education, housing, development, and the right to life. It is widening social and gender inequality and leading to violence and marginalization. These impacts are felt disproportionately, of course, in Africa, where people are hit the hardest with the least ability to adapt to the consequences of climate change. Such climate emergency exists where the most vulnerable are, in fact, at the same time, the most affected. Therefore, it is laudable that in 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council took an important step by recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This right is an important catalyst for change, being crucial for the right to life, food, decent work, and others. To ensure greater climate justice, African countries need strong national legal frameworks to spur equitable and sustainable management of natural resources. Especially women and indigenous people are powerful climate justice advocates that can play, for instance, a critical role in the management, in the improved management of land and natural resources. Conversely, gender inequality and unequal access of women to land, natural resources, and other assets constrain their ability to deal with climate injustices, disasters, and to fully enjoy their human rights. Therefore, international cooperation is key, but at the same time, international corporates still tend to exploit African countries with lax environmental policies and safety practices, not seldomly to the detriment of local populations. After all, climate change is a byproduct of an economic system that is heavily reliant on extraction, exploitation, accumulation, and dispossession. Now, this brings me to my second to last point, and that is climate justice versus climate responsibility. Both states, international corporations, institutions, and individuals in the global north and south should develop policies that more equitably balance extraction against community health and safety issues in future. Apart from climate litigation, and there have been quite a number of cases popping up in South Africa, but also in other parts of the continent and the world, climate litigation cases in courts as enforcement measures have the opportunity as a compliance mechanism to lead to stronger climate justice developments. However, the poor and marginalized often still lack access to justice, lack access to courts, and thus lacking access to climate justice altogether. And this is particularly true in the global south, of course. In that sense, the north-south divide needs to be bridged in this respect. Besides states, non-state actors must step up, contribute to the achievement of common objectives, tackling global challenges in order to achieve that public goods are protected, which then also reduces the global inequalities. First, when it comes to climate change, it is crucial to recognize that the global south and the global north face very different realities, which imply different capacities, different resources, as well as different priorities on the political agenda. Therefore, it is important to acknowledge that these different climate realities among different countries, among different communities, also trigger different responsibilities based, for instance, to historic pollution, which has contributed to the climate crisis that we're currently facing. Secondly, we might need to reconsider history and decolonize the climate justice debate by recognizing that climate change is a consequence of the unprecedented exploitation of natural resources, human production and consumption, which started with colonialism. In this light, I would like to end by quoting some passages from my new book, which was published open access recently, called Climate Change, Responsibility and Liability. And I quote, "It is imperative that all future climate policy will inevitably lead to a devaluation of fossil fuels while addressing the socio-economic impacts of a just energy transition. South Africa's contemporary economy, viewed through the lenses of climate justice, still projects the injustices of the past onto future generations because the burdens of mining and coal are still disproportionately borne by the poor, exacerbating the unjust legacies left behind by colonialism and apartheid. Ultimately, apartheid, colonialism, and the imperial past in Africa have long been centered around power, ports, settlement structures, access to land, exploitation of natural resources and commodities such as metals, crops and minerals, and subjugated laborers and people. The history of climate change is therefore also a history of capitalism, colonialism, and apartheid, of which all have been accompanied by serious human rights violations that need to stop. The principle of common but differentiated responsibility and capabilities formalized under international law at the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro is ultimately pertaining to the matter of climate justice. Its basic meaning is first and foremost a shared moral responsibility between different groups of countries to address global climate change. Nevertheless, the proportions of such responsibility are differentiated depending on individual capabilities. Now, how can we lead climate justice into new pathways? In light of the detrimental economic consequences after the COVID-19 pandemic or during the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian-Ukrainian aggression, especially to developing countries, the impacts cause urgent stress, and that contributes to existing climate injustices, calling for other responsibilities of the global north in terms of their commitment to provide more financial support to the global south, where human development is still stalling or sliding. In 2022, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, in its report stated that around half of the world's population is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, with those in highly vulnerable regions already 15 times more likely to die due to floods, droughts, storms compared to regions with very low vulnerability. The IPCC also made it clear that we are now in extraordinarily dangerous territory. With every small delay to proportionate action, we move closer to irredeemable climate injustice, damaging the climate and its and our ability to sustain the human population at large. Therefore, let me conclude, the global south, who contributed least to climate change, is legitimately longing for increasing support towards the cost of loss and damage from the global north, whose current and historic activities have largely contributed to the global climate crisis. With that simplified message, I would like to kick off the discussion here today, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Ripple. Have we got any questions or comments from the audience? Anything on the chat? From my side, I was very interested. You referred to human inaction, because we always think of what we do and not necessarily what we don't do. Could you perhaps just give an example, a specific example of something that was not done that perhaps could have been done perhaps in South Africa?
Well, thank you for the question. There are probably numerous issues that could have been done and should have been done and must have been done, but they hadn't been done. And therefore, we have to ask our questions, what can be done to remedy that? And in terms of what should have been done, it is my perspective that, especially from a fossil fuel point of view, from a coal point of view, from an energy point of view, much should have been done earlier, not only to mitigate wherever possible climate change, but also to protect the people, not only from the impacts of power outage, but also from the contribution to the climate crisis. And obviously, coal is subject to current debate and will be even more in COP27 debates in Sharm el-Sheikh. And it's my sincere hope that due to the global energy crisis, the aspect of coal is not elevated to a new level that becomes even more detrimental to climate developments.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Bongani.
Thank you, Mr. President. As you were talking, Prof, I just had.
I'm sorry, but I can't hear you well.
Put your mic on. Oh, you have to come here.
So perhaps you can come stand here. I think that'll be the easiest. Thanks.
So as you were talking, Prof, I just jotted something down to say, in terms of we know that there are debates, I would say at international level, where some developing countries feel that they should be absolved, when it comes to the greenhouse emissions, that is the minimization of such by the different countries. Would you say perhaps, that argument is sound, considering the issue of north-south, divide, and the fact that in terms of our economies, we lag behind? I'm also thinking about, fracking in the Karoo, the issues of fracking in the Karoo, the issue of mining rights at Ekolobeni, those are debates that are there, where some people say it should go on, some people say because of the environment it shouldn't. Would you say that that is fair, basically? What is your view on that, maybe?
Well, thanks, sir. That's an important question, and of course, you're putting the finger in the wound where we have to balance the interests between economic development, between job creation, between poverty reduction, but at the same time, at environmental protection, at protection of future generations, at the protection against non-reversible damage. And that is a difficult task. I think there can be no absolution for anyone, because we live on a global, we live on a planet as a global community where the responsibilities have to be adjusted to action and inaction. And there can be no wavering, but there can be global cooperation that leads to an improved situation in the interests of the survival of this planet and of people. In that sense, of course, the dichotomy that existed under the Kyoto Protocol in Annex and non-Annex 1 countries, where some have more responsibilities towards previous greenhouse gas emissions and the reduction obligations, that common but differentiated responsibility and capabilities question plays a very important role. It cannot be wavered, and I think that is also something up for discussion at COP27. When it comes to the acknowledgement and the better handling of the loss and damage debate. I hope that responds to your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Is there anything else anybody would like to add or ask? Well, thank you very much for your time, Professor Ripple. We really appreciate it, and that was most interesting. So yes, thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Good luck
Thank
for
you.
the seminar.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Welcome. And also here. Sorry, what I'm going to do. You can just go first and then can you choose the mic because just a hello for
Hello.
yeah. Okay, I'm just going to put the camera off so that we can see his slides. Yes. So you put it open. There you go. So you can just press the mic on and the mic is on.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and it is very exciting to be here in person and to see all of us here and those of us that have joined online. Thank you very much for the invitation to share my research result with the group that are here today. And starting with, I have this slide that I put up first, and you shouldn't be expecting something like this. So we are talking about climate change, I would expect. But for a moment, if we think about it, and you are an educator, and you give an assignment like this, and you hear a child telling you that what is the favorite thing that he or she wants to do is actually the living, just going home. That could be a little bit unexpected, you would say. But how about if we adopt the position of the child and get to see what she is seeing so that we have an understanding why she is interested in this particular aspect of her life in school. And perhaps that brings me to what I want to talk about. That oftentimes when we talk about actions, climate actions, our expectations move to the perspectives of the elites, including the government and experts. But what if we are listening to people who are the very ones that needs to change behaviors regarding climate change? And with Professor Martin de Wit, we've been working on how South Africans and other countries in Africa discuss and imagine the future of energy. And for this particular work, we phrased the topic Voices from the Bottom, a social media analysis of public views on the COP26 Coal Phase Out deal that was given to South Africa. So the previous speaker talked about what is the reality regarding energy and climate change. It has become very important, and all over the world, there is now a renewed interest in renewable energy because we have seen the link between how we produce, distribute, and consume energy, and what we are seeing regarding increase in temperature and the impacts that climate change have across societies. And while there is now this interest to shift from fossil fuel to less carbon energy, within the context of Africa, we are not seeing much of the deployment or the development of renewable energy. And the reason is because, as we learned from International Energy Agency, funding is a big challenge, it's a barrier for many developing countries, including Africa. And because of this, as the previous speaker talked about, it becomes important that developed countries, who are primarily the biggest contributors to emission, give some kind of help to the countries in the global south. And so in the case of South Africa, during the last COP26 in Glasgow, there was a deal that was discussed between South Africa, United Kingdom, France, USA, and Europe. And basically 8.5 billion US dollars was promised to be given to South Africa to reduce reliance on coal. This is important because coal contributes, the energy mix for South Africa, 65% of that is coal, and about over 80% is a whole mix of fossil fuel. So it becomes an important interest for the global community that is interested in reducing climate change. Taking actions on mitigation. And for the South African government, this point becomes important because it is a watershed moment for them. The money would be used to, in a way, support the ambitious plan that they have towards 2013 regarding nationally determined contributions. But also, the money would provide important support for transitions, especially with regards to people who work within the industry, the coal-allied industry. Now, that is one story. But what if we look at the social context of energy transitions and we learn from literature that it is usually fraught with tension, and sometimes this comes from vested interest in the industry that you want to challenge, but also you have the question of what alternatives are available to the society, and where should this be cited? Who should benefit and rest? And then you have things like values playing a role. The energy, the one we want to move to, how do we consider the impacts that health impacts that it can bring, and what are the economic rationality? Who would lose? Who would gain? These are not straightforward questions, and usually it is not the same across societies. So that what are the contestations in Australia? They're not the same for South Africa, and for this important reason, we felt that COP26 is important, provides an important junction to look at how South Africans discuss and imagine energy futures. So, but we also learned from the literature that oftentimes when papers consider this social context, interviews, usually targeting experts, are used, surveys and traditional studies of news media are used. For our case, we say, let's look at social media, primarily because in the developing countries, social media has become the primary source of news. People tend to read news while they are browsing through their phones for Facebook or other social media. But also this particular media bridge the gap between those who produce and those who consume the news. And we can access real-time information that can give us a better pulse regarding what we intend to investigate. So we look at Facebook primarily because it is the number one within South Africa in terms of people who respond to survey that this is where they get their news from. So we built our study based on the number of literatures you see in here, and what is very striking is that several of them are done within context that are not in Africa. So we are, in a way, trying to start the conversation. And for our particular case, we are interested in looking at what sentiments do people bring to bear on this particular issue as it was raised in the news in terms of the arguments that they bring in. And by sentiments, we are interested in the dispositions within comments that individuals who commented on news that were posted regarding the COP26 deal raised in the Facebook page. So we went about scrubbing comments from Facebook, and what we did was to first identify South African news medias that host pages on Facebook and share news. And after that, we basically followed through to screen contents that were of interest to us in terms of whether they are discussing this particular deal for South Africa. And what we found were that 8 South African news media shared comments and posts regarding this particular news item. And out of them, there were over 5,000 comments that we screened. And out of these 5,000 comments, over 3,980 comments was what we finally analyzed based on these exclusionary measures we took. Comments that were not written in English were excluded because we were not experts in the non-English languages for South Africa. And if you check it, it is less in comparison. And for that, we were able to, in a way, avoid it. So the first thing we did was to group this news post based on how did the news media framed this particular issue for the public. And what we realized was 11 of them basically announced the deal. Another 7 set it up as a conflict. Certain sections of South Africans do not like this deal. And another basically phrased it as in support of the deal. Another 5 clarified the deal and other themes that were raised. Now with this, our interest is to see whether the sentiments as well as these opinions that people share differ according to this particular categorization. So the first, then in terms of how we went about our analysis, we utilized a qualitative sentiment and thematic analysis. It is qualitative because it was not run unsupervised by algorithm, and we did it within Atlas TI, relying on contributions from Fries and Saldana. And basically, what we did was to categorize each comment, whether it gives support, positive sentiment or negative, or positive with reservation, and whether it is neutral. And for the contents, we also looked out for what are the opinions and arguments that South Africans were sharing as they reacted to the news on Facebook. And we went through to generate themes, which we report in our research. Now, regarding topics, basically the views that South Africans expressed, we came up with 3 overarching themes. The first is that there were certain comments that laid themselves out as legitimizing. They legitimize the deal, saying it is right for South Africa and acceptable, and another that says it is not right and acceptable to South Africans. And they were cutting issues within the discourse. So each of them raised different topics that we grouped in. All right, thank you. All right, so moving on now, we want to begin to share the results of our analysis to talk about how South Africans, the attitudes that they brought to bear on the news. And this immediately tells you that we have something similar to what we saw earlier in the first page, something that we did not expect to see. The case of our result, you recognize that there were overwhelming negative sentiments regarding the deal for South Africa. And you might be wondering, is this really good for, or what we hope for, given that the deal could multiply the options for energy that South Africa would have? And we say, hold on with your thoughts, because when you see what issues they are bringing to bear, you might have an understanding of why this was the case for South Africa. But also, as we say, we tried to compare it across the news frame. And what we discovered was that when the news media phrased it as a conflict, there were more equal reaction post the deal as compared to the other phrases where negative sentiments stood out in the news. So now let's look at the arguments and opinions that South Africans expressed. And what we first of all did was to look at the patterns we observed. And what we saw was that the delegitimizing deals, arguments were used to express negative sentiments about the deal. And legitimizing opinions were used to express positive sentiments. Whereas for those that shared middle ground, we like this deal, but these issues are of concern to us. You see, they have weaker relationships with both the legitimizing opinions and the delegitimizing opinion. Now, when we tried to plot basically the topics according to how grounded the codes were within our analysis, we came up with the top 6. And what you would see is that corruption, distrust in institutions, foreign influence, the fear or concern about foreign influence, and load burden and hypocrisy of the West, as well as other countries are not concerned, and anxiety about job loss were the issues that that were on the top concern for South Africans that discussed the deal. And when you look at, in terms of those who expressed positive sentiments, the first and the top on the list for them is the concern that those who are opposing the deal have stakes in co-related industry. That's how they express themselves in the comment sections. Oh, you are against this deal because you are benefiting from the fossil fuel industry. But other than that, what is generally seen in literature is what we also confirmed, that concern about the environment or the planet, and the fact that renewable energy would provide alternatives and improved energy availability for people. And the fact that South Africa is experiencing energy crisis were the top issues that were raised in the discourse that we analyzed. Now, we want to pay some attention to the top issues that were raised within the discourse. And the first one about corruption. What you would find is within Comment 1, for instance, it is said that the fund, if it is released, would be stolen or it would disappear. And when we tried to map the number of times these words occurred, for instance, the word go, steal, loot appeared over 700 times within the discourse itself, which showed excessive interest in how this there is low trust that this money would be available for use. But also, people doubt that it would have intended value in terms of if it is released, whether it would be used for this particular purpose. And the trust in government was pronounced very low. And when we paid attention to pronouns and nouns that were used within the discourse, what we found was excessive mention of ANC, the ruling party, and the government cadres and the rest functionaries within the government. We also looked at how they perceived the foreign nations that are making this offer. And what we found out was that there is a criticism that the West is hypocritical, as you would see in the first quotation, for instance. It says that we are told by America and Europe to do away with coal while themselves are heavily dependent on coal. And you find this kind of argument made across the discourse. But also, the deal amounts to, in a way, another neo-colonialism. Are they coming to colonize us, to dispossess us of lands and whatnot? These were some of the issues that were raised. And of course, concerned that the deal is another debt trap for South Africans. And overarchingly, what we found is that the suspicion boils down to how South Africa perceives basically the foreigners, the foreign nations that are making this deal. Then we looked at, to just highlight that within the discourse, those who were commenting positively were basically reacting all the time in the cases that we observed. What I meant by that is social media is a network communication. So there is an issue raised, somebody comments, and then you react. And in the case of this particular one, the negative commenters were the one leading the conversation, and those who are interested in the deal were basically reacting all the time in the comments, and that's what this particular chart tries to display. And now to conclude my presentation, what we want to leave with you is that beyond environmental concerns, renewable energy is attractive in context where there is already energy crisis, and South Africa is one. And for this reason, if we want to move on with renewable energy, communication can focus on this particular aspect to sell the prospect of renewable energy as an alternative and a viable one for South Africa. Then one thing that we realized that is not well prioritized within the literature for social acceptance is that governance consideration is relegated to the background. But our study shows, especially in the context of South Africa, that it is an important issue for people if their support is needed for energy transition. And we recommend that the South African transition project would make sense if it can take on the issue of corruption and hold energy-related institutions to good governance standard, including making sure that there's transparency for how the project is faced from the beginning to the end. And one of the important aspects of it would be to include the citizens in all the processes. The last point we want to make is that perceptions about sources of capital is important when the public wants to consider whether they give support to a particular energy transition issue. So in the case of South Africa, it was shown that there were aversion towards foreign loan. And this is not just within this particular context. Afrobarometer survey of 2021 did show that 6 in 10 South Africans prefer local sourcing of funds for development. And over 51% citizens expressed aversion towards foreign loans. In literature, this was connected to the issue of dispossession and historical issues of apartheid, where foreign influence tends to have negative perceptions within South Africa. So just to sound that there are limitations to our paper, and the first is that, as we noted, non-English Facebook comments were not considered. But again, it was 6% of the general comments that we extracted. And our approach was largely interpretative. We did ensure that there was rigor in our process as Atlas TI provides. And for future research, we are proposing that perhaps a more deep machine learning that include other social media environments can give us better perspectives to complement what we have. So thank you very much for listening.
Corruption issue would come up, but I don't think it would be, I would say 5% of the total comments referring to that. Before I hand over to the audience for questions, I was just wondering, have you got any idea how this would compare to public opinion in other countries, perhaps about these issues?
Thank you for that question. For instance, in Australia, the concerns were not about corruption, but about loss of economic options for people who are in the industry. And in the case of, if I remember correctly, New Zealand as well, same. And for positive sentiments, it's about concern about environment. And this becomes important in the case of South Africa. And that's why in the main manuscript, we highlight that for developing countries, what will be more important is actually concern about governance issues, because if this money is available, what would happen to it at the end? This is a big question that is in the minds of the public in developing countries, I would expect.
That's ridiculous. Anyway, any questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for getting us to an interesting area of social media. But I would just wish if I could hear maybe your voice on how does, because the first speaker talked about procedural justice, also aspects of justice. So how does maybe the concept about the response from the or the social media in general, how does it influence the implementation of this particular bill?
Thank you for that question. It is widely. Okay, please come.
Sorry, you just have to stand in front of me so the camera's not on, so you can just repeat your question.
Okay, thank you. My question is, how does the concern or the responses from the social media affect the implementation of this deal on phasing out of coal in South Africa? How does it influence the implementation? That is the procedural process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think you've supplied the first keyword there, procedural justice. What we, in the past 4 years, my interest has been on looking at how publics in various countries in Africa are discussing climate change and climate actions. And the interest is because we need to expand the options of discussions that we are having beyond the policy environment itself alone. So what our study is basically showing is to highlight the importance of involving the citizens. And by doing that, we can then better the approach that we have towards the issues. For instance, the coal phase out deal. So if the study is showing that there is a need to pay attention to governance issues, and it can be highlighted, then those who are drafting the policy and driving it would have to pay attention to it and include it. That way we can have a better outcome. Beyond that, I am not part of the policy makers, but our interest is to highlight these issues for public conversation, and hopefully it will be picked up and energize how the public discuss the issue going forward.
So, is there I know it might be a bit difficult, this one, but was there a way to maybe try and find out whether political, the political environment, or even, political considerations are not really affecting the debate in terms of how it's, to see 75% of people being negative and all, corruption, etc., etc. It might be that, it's politics also, it's not necessarily the discussion of the deal that is, framing the debate. So in terms of analyzing, those social media engagements, did you find out anything, in terms of drilling the opinions and, checking whether in terms of their political views?
Thank you. So that I ask for clarity before you go.
Yeah.
Would I be right if I say you are interested in whether these views align with political opinion or ideologies that individuals?
Yes.
Okay,
exactly.
thank you. So there is limitation to what you can do within social media. First is access to data. What kind of data is available? Basically, individuals that there are restrictions. That's the first thing to what you can assess about individuals. The other one is the data you extract in our case does not include political what do you call it? Political alignment of individuals that do the comments. And we also disregard demographic distributions of the commenters, partly because you cannot extract that based on the Facebook policy for data access. So if you were to do something like that, survey would be the important tool to use in order to gauge how political ideologies align with dispositions towards a particular energy transition.
Just in terms of using only English comments, I know that all research is limited in one way or another, but it's considerably excludes a large portion of South Africa in using only English comments in your analysis. So how did you account for that in your research on particularly with you that you wouldn't have had from maybe the informal or maybe even minor acceptance of the economy across the country?
So maybe for the benefit of those who are online, she's asking about with the exclusion of the non-English comments, how does that, I think I've lost there.
Yeah.
Okay, how did we account for the exclusion? Basically, we did not. We first of all simply acknowledge that that was not included, and we did show that what we showed the proportion of that exclusion to the total comments that we analyzed, and it was 6% of that. And apparently, our what do you call it, assumption is that if we do include those, it would have little influence in swaying what we found. And we did experiment with Google Translation to see how it paired. And that was where it was leading us, but we could not trust that because we can't vouch for the translation. So we did not account for the non-English comments. Thank you. Thank you.
I prefer, it would be very interesting to see other African countries' views.
Going to move over to our next two speakers. Just opening up. The camera is not on, but the audio is on. We can just take a close here for the sound.
Yeah.
Just stand here and then just keep it.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Curtis Bailey, and this is my colleague, Belinda Clark. We're from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies from Right at Stellenbosch University. So our talk comprises an overview on the paper that we're currently busy with, detailing open access or open source geospatial data repositories and platforms that can be used in climate change analyses and also in climate change mitigation and thus climate justice. Okay, so before we started this whole presentation, I decided just to go onto Google to check out what the news is saying about climate change, about climate justice. And these are all the headlines I found just dating from June. So you can see there's a lot of news on climate change and issues of climate justice, from new climate records being broken to climate change protests in Paris, and then things relating to food insecurity and climate resilience. It's also climate justice. So I don't want to bore you, but I think it's always important just to do a recap of what climate change is. So climate change refers to the process of shifting weather patterns and climate regimes of different areas across the globe. We know in history that it's been predominantly a natural process, but science now tells us and study tells that it's at least since the 19th century that anthropogenic influence, later related to the advent of the Industrial Revolution, has increased industry and our usage of fossil fuels and energy. And this in turn resulted in an increased emission of greenhouse gases, which has warmed up our atmosphere. Now, as these emissions continue to increase, our atmosphere perpetually warms up. And so we've got a case where the Earth's temperature has increased by at least 1 to 1.5 degrees since that advent. So to summarize that, so the causes of climate change can be related to the rapid industrialization. This is anthropogenic activity also disrupting natural processes such as deforestation. This in turn disrupts our natural processes and results or has a knock-on effect to our climate. Results in climatic shifts, rising sea level, shifts in biodiversity patterns, and also rising sea levels. So who does climate change affect? So the socioeconomic impacts of climate change are varied, but it relates to topics such as food and water, insecurity, famine, mass movements, past potential emergence of new diseases. And that's why discourse and conferences like these are so important, which relate to climate change as a whole. What does climate change mean for South Africa? So for South Africa, climate change means, depending on which paper you read, which model you follow, an increase of 1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius mean annual temperature. Some regions I found in the CSIR's paper and their simulation model, like the coastal areas of the Southern Cape and the Western Cape, might increase by 3 to 3.5 degrees. Most analyses or models expect an increase in precipitation in the eastern parts of the country and a decrease in the western parts, although that signal is not as clear. In terms of weather on a day-to-day basis, we can expect an increase in unpredictable weather patterns, flash floods, increasing events such as cut-off lows, which result in landslides, which we've seen on the eastern parts of the country. Ecological impacts, or ecological sensitive areas such as the Cape Fynbos may be exposed to increased fire season or prolonged fire season. And that also has impact on agriculture as well as food security in a water scarce country such as South Africa. Importantly, who does climate change affect in South Africa? So the short answer is that climate change is expected to affect every single citizen living in this country directly or indirectly. We're all going to be affected by it. I think the more important or the more appropriate question would be, who is adversely going to be affected by climate change? Still all of us, but to a greater degrees, the disadvantaged communities of South Africa are more susceptible and vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So it is within this disproportionality that the issue of climate justice or injustice arises.
Climate justice acknowledges that those who bear the costs of climate change are not the ones who caused it. Climate justice is a concept that addresses just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change and responsibilities to deal with climate change. It relates the causes and effects of climate change to concepts of justice. Climate justice examines various concepts relating to equality, collective rights, historical responsibilities. And in general, they are understood in 3 different areas. So procedural justice emphasizes fair and transparent decision and inclusive decision-making. Distributive justice emphasizes who bears the cost of both climate change and actions taken to address it. Recognition is the basic respect and robust engagement with diverse cultures and perspectives. So what we were asked to look at is how can open access to look at how open access to GIS and remote sensing can help achieve these aims. So a geographical information system is an information system for storing and analyzing and visualizing spatial data, and remote sensing is anything to do with collecting data without touching the object or phenomenon that you are studying. We're going to focus on passive satellite remote sensing. So in the picture, you can see that there's incoming solar radiation. This interacts with the object, and a certain amount is absorbed and a certain amount is reflected back to the satellites. Different objects have unique spectral signatures, and so we can identify them and we can monitor them. The American and European Union satellites give free, easy access to remotely sensed imagery at the scale of 10 meters to 30 meters, with global coverage on a daily basis. These systems have been functioning for many years. Thus, these systems provide information at the spatial and temporal scales required to answer pertinent questions. Note that other countries and constellations are slowly coming up to the same standards, particularly the Indian one. So, based on our quick look at the literature, and we realize that we need to do further engagement to further validate this list, but the questions that we came up with of where GIS and remote sensing can help is, there are a number, and I'll just highlight a few. What will the consequences be? Where will they be felt most? And who will the consequences most negatively impact? We looked at what open access resources are available in terms of platforms that provide GIS and remote sensing data or analytical tools. We asked the following questions of these platforms. What is the focus? Does it include socioeconomic aspects in addition to environmental? How accessible is the platform to various types of users? And what is the scale of coverage? Also did a literature review, and here I'd just like to acknowledge Marie Tron of our library for helping us with this. So we ran a Scopus search with the search terms highlighted there in various pieces of literature, because we didn't want to just see the peer-reviewed contribution. We wanted to see government reports and similar. And the questions we asked of this is, where is the author affiliation relative to the study area? Was open access data used? And the output data and code, is that open access then? And then the topic of study, was it local or generally applicable?
Okay, so before we start with the different platforms and data repositories, I just want to clear what we mean by open access. We mean that the data are freely available. The code are also freely available. It's allowed to be redistributed, modified, and so are the functionalities of whatever platform it might be. The first one we found was the CSIR's Green Book, which has become recently quite popular. It is a practical online spatial planning tool, as I mentioned, developed by the CSIR, mandated by the Department of Science and Innovation. So they made this little online tool to see which communities in the country are well adapted, or how well communities are adapted to climate change, both in terms of natural adaptation to natural hazard, as well as socio-economically. So the analyses or report were comprised at conducted at both settlement and a national municipal level. So if I can draw your attention to the image on my right, your left, is an example of settlement vulnerability to wildfire using climate change models and simulations into the future. So it identifies which areas in terms of settlement are most at risk. Then they've also done a socioeconomic vulnerability index, which includes things such as increasing population, so population dynamics, food security, and so forth, climate, and derived the socioeconomic vulnerability index. The next is a pretty cool new platform called Digital Earth Africa. There are quite a few calls for it available. So Digital Earth Africa is also an online platform, data repository. It has many raw and processed data sets. The data sets are varied. It includes things such as satellite imagery, climate hazards, food security, water management. The data are available at a variety of spatial scales. The one sort of not downfall, but negative of this site is that it's heavily script driven. So new tools are added using script. So this is what Digital Earth Africa's interface looks like. It's specifically tailored to the African continent in terms of its products. So you can see things such as cropland expansion, food security in terms of drought monitoring, surface temperature, and so forth. Some of the data are static, so beginner users can use it to maybe scroll and look. But if you want to create your own tools, analyze the data, it's more for an advanced user. So then we get to GitHub, which is an open source data repository where you can just kind of chunk your code. As of 2020, there were about 500 to 550 different repositories specifically related to climate change, which entail codes and script related to urban growth metrics, vegetation degradation, CO2 monitoring, and so forth. It is a script-intensive repository, but it does have useful data installation tutorials, which can assist you if you're a beginner user. I would recommend it more for the advanced user. It are useful to researchers or people who have been exposed to scripting, but also non-profit organizations, as well as even citizen scientists, if you're willing to take up the challenge to understand some scripting. Then a recent application is the Cape Farm Mapper. It's a product of the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. So if you are an agricultural enthusiast and you're interested to see how agriculture might be influenced by climate change, this is where you can go to. It's got a lot of useful data layers at a regional extent, regional for the Western Cape. Some data date back as far as 20 years. So it's got satellite imagery, agricultural tourism, like wine farm industry. So you can use that to see how wine farms may be influenced by climate change into the future. This is the interface. So on the left, you have got your available data sets, and you can then change the base map, using the layers on the right. Then a paper for a local explorative analysis, which we found was the City of Cape Town's geospatial portal. So they've got a lot of static data. What's useful about their data is that it's consistently being updated by dedicated GIS technicians, as well as remote sensing specialists. So the data are well maintained, available as raw and processed products at a variety of spatial scales. It has extensive social data, so census data, data related to household incomes, insecurity. Hopefully with the next census data, it'd be even be more impressive. As I mentioned, it's useful for a local explorative analysis to identify disadvantaged communities or which communities are most at risk. And it generally can be used by the beginner if you used to study viewing static spatial layers. You can use the data for analysis like much of our students use for masters, even for PhD students. Then we get to the big guys. So this is Copernicus, which I think most people have heard about if you work in the climate change industry. Copernicus is an online international platform. It's European. It's monitored by ESA and EMUSAT. It has a variety of raw and processed data sets, several petabytes in size. Some of the data are updated daily, weekly, depending on what you're looking at in terms of decades. It's got simulation, climate simulations, some forecasting, and then it also monitors things such as land cover change, security, as well as marine life. So this is what their catalog look like. It's pretty extensive. If you're interested in how glaciers might influence sea levels and influence, which I know some of the SIR data products are using, which communities along the coast might be submerged at this level. They've got data for that. As you can see, they have model data all the way to 1755, so 300 and so 400 year data model simulation, which is pretty cool. Most of the data are used in a variety of studies. We found things looking at mean surface temperature, how this temperature deviates from the current mean, the past mean, and to model that into the future. Carbon monoxide trends, and then also methane gas trends, which are your CO2 related gases. So who uses Copernicus products? Well, there are many people who use Copernicus products, so the users are extremely varied. They've got static data layers if you just want a static satellite image to observe maybe land cover change from a certain date. Then they have got data available for the more advanced users, so people, citizen scientists. If you're an academic, you can download data. If you've got programming or an analytical experience with GIS, or things such as R, then you can get data for academic papers, and it's also useful for at a government and policy and decision-making level. Then we get to another big guy, the National Center for Environmental Information, which is the American basically counterpart of Copernicus. They have got one of the largest, if not one of the largest global repositories of geospatial and spatial data, which can be used in climate change. It's managed by the US Department of commerce, variety of raw and processed products, which have a variety of application. So depending on what you want to download the data for, you can use it for at a government level, for academic research, even in the private sector. So these are some of the products looking at land cover change, eutrophication. The NOAA also looks at things as like La Nina, how La Nina might trend into the future, and CO concentrations and so forth. So then we get to NASA and RSET. So NASA is our people in our field's friend, because they basically had a big contribution in the development of remote sensing with the launch of their satellites. So if you're in climate, you know about motors, their burn scar products, and so forth. So NASA has got a huge variety of processed data sets, variable application. They've got things related to potentially evapotranspiration, food security, water insecurity at a global as well as a local extent. And progressively, they are including people in the discussion of the data that they are collecting and uploading, which derives to brought us to the point of the RSET, which is basically this novel training program that they've developed for beginner level people who don't have experience with remote sensing and geospatial software. So if you're from a field of forestry, they'll train you online or in person, depending where you are in the world, to use geospatial data, to manipulate geospatial data, particularly for the application that you want to use that data for. So if you want to see how forests are changing in terms of rainforest monitoring, you can apply for the RSET program. So it's basically a bottoms-up approach to understanding geospatial data, using it in doing analysis and deriving useful information from it.
IPPC working group have a data distribution center that aims to provide transparent, accessible data on scenarios and outputs that have been produced in their reports. It aims to create new data sets that are unavailable elsewhere and to link to external data sets of relevance. Importantly, it aims to improve accessibility, particularly to developing countries, and it lays an emphasis on capacity building. They recognize the importance of socioeconomic data, but preliminary investigation only found a few tables and figures rather than spatial data sets that are easy to manipulate. The visualization tool was also unfortunately not working at the time of the study. The longevity of the web-based data houses like this is always challenging, and we noted that some pages have not been updated since 2019. Perhaps partnerships with other funded organizations can help improve sustainability of this and other facilities. Column is a long-standing database that has been used in many studies. It provides 18 layers of temperature and precipitation data based on extrapolations from tens of thousands of weather stations. It's provided at a 1 kilometer scale, and it runs roughly from 1970 to 2018. More recently, it also includes future climate projections under various scenarios. And these are slightly coarser, they're about 56 kilometers square. Ecoclimate is very similar to WorldClim, but with the addition of pre-industrial and paleo timescale layers, allowing analyses such as whether the current and projected patterns of the Anthropocene exceed the range of what would have been present in the Holocene. SPARK is a recently completed initiative, and it provides current and projected species and biome distributions. It highlights which species and biomes are at risk due to the rapidity or speed of range changes. It provides priorities for vulnerable biodiversity and highlights protected areas and corridors that are needed. Data are freely available, and various web-based tools to assist with the visualization and understanding the data and results in local areas can be easily accessed. IPAMA has been running for 10 years and has included target users from the beginning of its development. It aims to facilitate improved management and governance of biodiversity and natural resources, initially focused on protected areas, but that's grown. It provides tools, services, and funding to conservation actors, specifically the Caribbean and Pacific countries. It has a web-based reference information system, which consists of a number of subcomponents, such as the one shown here on the screen, which is a protected areas management effectiveness tool. There are a number of useful tools under this facility, and some of these need to be downloaded. So then they are dependent on connectivity and computer specs. They are busy working on a strategy to make BioPAMA and its tools sustainable into the future. Google Earth Engine is aimed at providing multi-petabytes of satellite imagery and various geospatial datasets, along with planetary scale analysis capabilities. Scientists, researchers, and developers use Earth Engine to detect changes, map trends, and quantify differences on the Earth's surface. It includes various socio-economic datasets, and this facilitates progress on various global challenges. Only useful to high-end users as it is script-driven, but the outputs do make a difference, and the longevity of the system is secure.
We found that most of the analyses were done in licensed software, such as ArcGIS, when it came to the fancy things. But there were also a few of the literature that used QGIS. So QGIS, if no one's known about it, and that doesn't know about it, it is an open source and free to download GIS software package. So it allows you to view, analyze, visualize, and also publish geospatial information. It's got a lot of plugins and tools, which means it can be linked to Google imagery, Python. It's quite sophisticated. And as of, I think, 2021, there were about 200,000 active daily users. So QGIS, depending on what you do, can be used at the beginner level all the way up to the advanced user. So a lot of the papers we looked at, and just from this discussion, is a script. So what we've noticed that is there's been an emerging pattern or trend where more and more analyses are highly script-driven. And I suppose that makes sense because we live in the age of big data and these massive data sets, and we want to run through a lot of data quite fast. You know, the age of automation, you don't want to sit there manually doing these things. And which is driven, a lot of people would not usually use or script into the world of scripting. So you don't want to be like advanced scripter, but having it as a tool to do analysis to assist you is important. And when you're talking about geospatial analysis, Python is the language of choice. It's probably the easiest of the languages to master, and it's what's used by things such as ArcGIS, which have now embedded Python dedicated windows to speed up your analysis. As you also saw in the previous mention of Google Earth Engine, it uses Python as its main language. Then there's also R. I'm not going to talk a lot about R because I'm sure most people are familiar with R. It is more for data science driven tasks, heavily being used. It has a lot of packages, biogeographic, even some food security packages that are dedicated to that to achieve that task. We couldn't mention all of the tools and data ports and repositories that we found. I don't want to talk you to sleep by mentioning all of them. So here is a list of some others that we found that have some pretty cool functionalities and were present in the paper. So I'm happy to answer questions about them after our talk.
So our preliminary investigations show that climate justice goals can be answered using open access platforms, data, and tools. The focus of the platforms we investigated primarily include both socioeconomic and environmental aspects of climate change. This possibly indicates an uptake of the importance of socioeconomic factors in climate change work, and thus provides the ability to answer climate justice questions. Most of the platforms, while open access, are not necessarily accessible to everybody, as many require specialized knowledge. Noticeable exceptions exist, such as the easy-to-use City of Cape Town portal. High-end platforms are needed in order to run novel methods that may provide new understanding and solutions, but a greater emphasis is required to put tools in the hands of the public to understand their situation and how they can act. This does not need to be done through a myriad of websites. In fact, one or two effective websites that have been negotiated with stakeholders and carefully set up would probably be the most effective. A brief survey of publications included 50 publications produced over the last 2 years. This indicates that a lot of research on climate change is being conducted using GIS and remote sensing tools. A positive discovery is that the majority of work is produced by first authors at institutes in the area under study, rather than the predominance of parachute science that we have seen in the past. While most studies used open access datasets, few studies made output data and or code available, limiting the usefulness to one-source findings and reducing the ability to replicate local studies to provide global understanding of patterns and issues that could lead to the development of effective solutions. The lack of easy access to output data and code of published studies is particularly disappointing in the light of the observation that many of these studies were publicly funded. But to further this research, we need to engage with climate justice groups and researchers to better understand the needs for climate justice and how GIS and remote sensing could help these. We recommend that efforts to provide open access GIS and remote sensing tools for climate justice need to be carefully planned with all players in terms of content and functionality. Long-term viability of tools needs to be carefully considered. Many web-based GIS information tools have been developed over the years, but financial sustainability is always an issue. And pay-as-you-go systems, such as the major list for European countries, won't address climate injustices. Perhaps the answer is that we all work together with existing big players that have proven long-term funding, such as the NASA NOAA facilities in America and Copernicus in Europe. For instance, housing the IPCC's DCC jointly with one of these might be the easiest way forward to keep it current. Oops. In our goal could be to build on one or two existing platforms to provide information in clear, easy to navigate manner to the person on the street. Part of the planning needs to include an awareness campaign or awareness campaigns. Regarding publications, it should become mandatory to submit code and output data unless there's a clear justification for data sensitivity with the initial submission of an article for consideration for publication in a journal. Species occurrence data from journal articles can go to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Code can go to GitHub that we've already discussed. But what about all the other types of output data? And here we feel that informatics professionals can assist in thinking through where such study-specific data could be submitted and housed. Again, awareness initiatives are key so that local actors in climate justice and action know of these tools and datasets. Possibly this could be achieved through the UN, IPCC, and climate justice groups. In summary, we feel that open access GIS and remote sensing can play a vital role in climate justice, and we hope that this preliminary work can stimulate further discussion and collaborative work. Please do chat to us, and thanks very much for your time.
Asking open data, and I can't think any instance where climate data should not be available. Yeah, but anyway, there's a data section, for example, rainfall instead of watch over the last 50 years. I mean, it could be useful for me and you, it could be useful for researchers, for agriculture, you name it. Anyway, any questions from the audience?
Maybe while people are thinking through comments, Curtis can speak to his experiences with gathering climate data in South Africa that is collected with taxpayers' money. So does Aaron get your room to speak before?
No, I was just saying that it's difficult to collect data, and then when you do get the data, it is rainfall data. You have to look at the quality of that data, and it's not very well maintained. So then, what's the use of the data? So then you have to look for another resource that can sort of supplement where you've got missing data. So it is challenging, and it's not actually readily available. If you go to the South African Weather Service, you have to pay exorbitant amounts of money. Yes, unless you're a student and you want to use that data, but a person on the street can't just go to the weather service. It took thousands of rands for very small samples of data, rainfall data.
Thank you for that presentation. Just two questions. So you guys mentioned that users can perform a spatial analysis on the open access repositories, but you guys said that's more for the advanced users. So do you guys know if these open access repositories also provide training for users that don't have experience in GIS, for example, Esri provides these like step-by-step instructions on how to use some of the tools. And then secondly, do you guys think that non-open access data sources such as those that provided by Worldview should also be made available to the public?
Okay. So I think everyone got the first question. For the so some of these some of the repositories they are download tutorials and also to how to work with the data. But many of the platforms don't have any functionalities that allows you to analyze the data. So more of the advanced things you're going to, if you want to, you'd have to learn some scripting. If you want to work on something that's open source, such as GEE, then you can do the exact same analysis that you would do on something that's licensed. So if you add some scripting, then QGIS is free and it's got a lot of the analysis capabilities of something that is not that is licensed. So you're not restricted to using something that's licensed. You've got something like QGIS with its plugins and so forth. And as I mentioned, it really depends on the platform that whether it has got installation. Whether it's got tutorials to assist you. So it comes down to the platform. Esri is the fancy version that everyone goes for, but it's licensed, so it's a bit it's a bit niche in that regard. That answer your question? Okay.
It's also available to they can't repositories can't do like special analysis on them. So I think like maybe they could also provide a link to QGIS and like instructions as well. If they want, so they can say that this is how you can do your own spatial analysis if you wanted to.
Okay, that's a good point. Just to mention that some of them have process like data. So if you're looking for certain something, they may have it, but a lot of the times they don't. So then you want to utilize that. So then QGIS would suffice. But I agree, maybe having a link or instruction manual to, if you want to, use this to do this, would be useful as an online sort of resource.
And I'll respond to your question about data. So I feel after 20 years of dealing with data, anything collected with public funds. So if the taxpayer has contributed to anything, it should be publicly available unless a very strong motivation can be made. So for instance, there are privacy issues and we don't want to violate that at all. And occasionally you cannot release the locality of the last of a rare reptile because somebody will go and collect it. And that has happened in America. But just on over 20 years ago, most of the government institutions in the Western Cape got together and agreed that we should not be paying each other. I used to work for Cape Nature, that we should not be paying each other for the data, because then the public's is paying Cape Nature to create protected areas, and then we're charging agriculture to use the protected areas. And there'll be another government institution who is collecting roads data, and then they'll charge Cape Nature to use that data. So we did away with all of that 20 years ago. The South African Weather Service is one of the few that remains and holds out and will not provide its data for free. But yes, I think anything collected with public funds should be made publicly available.
Thank you also to those who have been joining us online. Yes, so we'll close the session for this afternoon, and thanks again for your participation. Thank you.
For our online viewers, thank you very much for your participation. And this concludes today's program. Please do not forget to register. We still have a full program tomorrow as well as Friday. Thank you. The recording will be available and the slides will also be sent on to you. A good day to you all.